There are stories in my family, I'm sure there are stories in your family, that are the stories that we tell every time we're together. Some stories that we tell, though, that give shape to our lives are stories of significance. They're stories that we reflect on because in that moment, our whole life is changed. This morning, we gather to tell one of those stories. This morning, we gather to tell one of the stories of how we have been deeply and radically changed. We gather to tell the story of Jesus Christ, who died and came back to life that we might live, who conquered the grave, who put death in its grave, who conquered sin, who reigns forevermore. We gather to tell a story that has changed us and transformed us, that has changed the entire course of history and continues to speak to our everyday lives. In some ways, Easter is the hardest Sunday to believe. Because the story that we tell today is so ridiculous and so surprising, it violates all the laws of nature. And I think it's easy to see this story and hear this story and say, well, that's a good fairy tale. And walk away as if it doesn't matter. As we gather this morning, that's the question that we ask. Is this more than just a story? Is this more than a fable or a fairy tale? Is this true? Is this true? Because, friends, the entire foundation of our life rests on this story and rests on its truth and power. And sometimes it's hard to believe. Sometimes it's hard to believe, and we are not the only ones who have lived in that place. You see, there's something so significant about this story, about the miracle of forgiveness and life. There's something so significant about this story that it touches our hearts and minds at that place where faith and doubt meet. And it calls to us to set aside the doubts and the questions that we carry and to live with faith. But sometimes that's not always an easy thing to do. But in many ways, the doubts that we carry attest to the power and miraculous nature of this story. Because, friends, if this story wasn't so big and meaningful, if it wasn't so powerful and transformational, it'd be a lot easier to write off. But the very fact that we wonder and question invites us to know the full power of this story. You see, faith sometimes starts best in the place of doubt, because it means the thing that we put our faith in is big enough and worth believing. Friends, this story is not too good to be true. It's too good not to be. It's so far beyond our ability to fathom that it must be true. A couple years ago, we were telling our kids about Easter and telling them the story of how Jesus had come and how he had loved people and how he had done miracles, but how he had made people a little bit nervous and uncomfortable, and they killed him. But he came back to life. Kylie sat there with her mouth just wide open as I told this story, and finally she looked at me and she said, "Dad, is that true?" And I said, "You bet it is. You bet it's true. Kylie, that actually happened." And to this day, my sweet daughter, when she prays at night, says, "Jesus, thank you for making dead people alive." But the resurrection turns our uncertainty into rejoicing. See, the resurrection reminds us that no matter what we face, Christ is with us. The resurrection reminds us that the worst thing is never the last thing. This story is a beautiful presentation of God's power, but there's also this beautiful moment where we see the tenderness and love that God has for us. You see, after the disciples stand there somewhat confused and uncertain as to what happened, they go back home, and Mary waits. Mary waits. And when she waits, Jesus appears to her. And she doesn't know it's him. I mean, why would she? She thought he was dead. But he comes and Mary begs him, tell me what happened to him. Tell me what happened to the one I love. She thinks he's the gardener. She mistakes him for somebody else until Jesus says her name. There's something beautiful about the moment that the risen Christ speaks your name, because it is in that moment that you know that you are fully and deeply loved. It is in that moment that the fears, the hurts, the burdens that you carry seem to melt away. It is in that moment that everything changes. Friends, the risen Christ calls your name. Jesus knows who you are. He knows the burdens that you carry. He knows the struggles that you have, and he loves you deeply and richly. You are God's beloved. There are lots of people in this world that need to hear Christ call their name. And friends, we're the ones who can say it. We are witnesses to the resurrection, who can speak a word of hope, a word of peace, a word of life over all those folks who need to know that something better is out there. Will you be a witness to the resurrection?